Welcome back. The most dangerous illusion in modern warfare is the belief that military power is measured by weapons. It is not. Military power is measured by duration, by how long a force can continue operating after the first shockwave hits. And what unfolded over these 5 days exposed something that defense planners across the world are now studying with growing alarm. A modern military can possess advanced aircraft, missile defense systems, elite special forces, and overwhelming firepower, and still find itself approaching paralysis if the logistics architecture underneath it collapses fast enough. Because this was never about destroying tanks. It was about making tanks impossible to move. But here's the problem. Most public discussion still treats logistics as background noise, something secondary, something technical. Yet every major war in modern history has ultimately been decided not by courage, but by sustainment. Fuel determines movement. Ammunition determines tempo. Food determines endurance. Spare parts determine survival rates. Remove those variables, and the battlefield changes shape almost immediately. And that is exactly what this campaign targeted. Not frontline units, not symbolic targets, not political theater. The system beneath the battlefield. This is where things change. The strikes were not random. They were sequenced with extraordinary discipline. Each phase prepared the conditions for the next. Port facilities were hit first, not because they were the most visible targets, but because they were the foundation of the entire resupply structure. Destroying maritime intake points meant future supplies could not enter at scale. But Iranian planners understood something even more important. A resilient military does not depend on one route. It survives through redundancy, which meant redundancy itself had to be eliminated. That is why the road and rail network was targeted immediately afterward. Not vehicles, infrastructure. There is a major difference between destroying a truck and destroying the bridge the truck requires to exist operationally. Vehicles can be replaced. A collapsed transport corridor cannot be improvised overnight, especially under wartime conditions. What happens next is where the campaign moved from disruption to systemic shutdown. Forward logistics depots were struck with a level of precision that carries enormous intelligence implications. These facilities are designed specifically to keep frontline forces operational when conventional supply lines fail. They are hardened, dispersed, protected by layers of operational secrecy. And yet the targeting packages appeared calibrated to exact locations. That matters more than most people understand. Because military intelligence is not just about finding targets. It is about maintaining updated confidence in targets over time. Someone had to identify these sites. Someone had to confirm changes. Someone had to verify operational relevance. That process requires patience, surveillance, and long-term planning. This was not improvisation. This was preparation. But here's where most people miss it. The real sophistication of the campaign was not the destruction itself. It was the understanding of compensatory behavior. Military planners always build fallback options. If ports fail, airlift takes over. If rail fails, roads compensate. If centralized depots are destroyed, forward stockpiles sustain operations temporarily. Iranian planners appear to have structured the campaign specifically around collapsing those fallback mechanisms before they could stabilize the system. That is what made the operation strategically dangerous. Not the damage, the sequencing. This is where things change. Once the maritime routes were constrained and overland transport corridors collapsed, the final emergency mechanism became air logistics. Heavy lift aircraft, rapid cargo insertion, emergency fuel and ammunition delivery. And then the runways were hit, not superficially, not symbolically. They were cratered in patterns designed to complicate rapid repair operations. Multiple impact points, subsurface damage, structural deformation beneath the visible surface layer. The objective was clear: deny operational tempo, not simply damage infrastructure. And when that happened, the entire equation changed. Because emergency resupply depends on time, and time was exactly what disappeared. What happens next is where logistics stops being abstract and becomes brutally physical. Armored formations consume enormous quantities of fuel every day. Modern mechanized warfare is not sustainable without uninterrupted energy flow. The public imagines tanks as symbols of strength. Military planners see them differently. They see consumption rates, maintenance cycles, fuel dependency. An armored brigade without fuel is not a fighting force. It is stationary metal. And once fuel reserves begin falling below operational thresholds, commanders are forced into impossible choices. Which sectors receive priority? Which units remain mobile? Which operations are postponed? Which risks are accepted? That process alone reshapes the battlefield before another shot is fired. But here's the deeper problem. Fuel shortages do not remain isolated. They spread outward through every layer of military activity. Aviation tempo declines. Reconnaissance becomes limited. Medical evacuation slows. Response times increase. Reserve repositioning becomes difficult. Operational flexibility contracts hour by hour. This is why logistics collapse is so dangerous. It creates cascading paralysis. And by day 5, signs of that paralysis were already emerging. This is where most people underestimate the severity. Ammunition consumption in high-intensity warfare is staggering. Artillery systems alone can burn through thousands of rounds daily across multiple fronts. Precision-guided munitions, mortar shells, anti-armor systems, interceptor missiles, every category operates on continuous replenishment. Once replenishment stops, commanders begin rationing. And the moment rationing begins, operational behavior changes. Fire missions become selective. Air support becomes restricted. Counter-battery responses slow. Defensive calculations shift from tactical preference to inventory preservation. At that stage, strategy is no longer driving battlefield decisions. Scarcity is. What happens next is the part rarely discussed publicly because it is politically uncomfortable. Food, not as symbolism, not as morale language, as biological reality. An active military force requires constant nutritional sustainment simply to maintain combat effectiveness. Hunger changes cognitive performance. It changes emotional regulation. It changes endurance and reaction speed. Military organizations understand this deeply, which is why ration planning is treated with enormous seriousness inside every major defense institution. And once reserve rations begin entering circulation, every commander understands the message immediately. The clock is running. But here's where the psychological dimension becomes critical. An army does not need to be physically destroyed to lose operational cohesion. It only needs enough friction, enough exhaustion, enough uncertainty that its tempo slows beneath the pace of the crisis surrounding it. That is the hidden dimension of logistics warfare. You are not attacking soldiers directly. You are attacking the conditions that allow soldiers to function predictably. This is where things change. Because once a military enters sustained scarcity conditions, decision-making transforms at every level simultaneously. Frontline personnel become more cautious. Officers become more conservative. Operational planning becomes reactive instead of proactive. Risks that would normally be acceptable become unacceptable because replacement capacity no longer exists. And suddenly, the battlefield belongs not to the side with more firepower, but to the side with more remaining endurance. That distinction is enormous, because endurance is invisible until it disappears. What happens next is where the American dimension becomes impossible to ignore. For decades, regional military architecture was built around one assumption. If escalation reached critical levels, the United States could stabilize the situation through rapid logistical reinforcement. But rapid reinforcement requires access points, ports, airfields, secure transit corridors. And if those access points are degraded simultaneously, the most advanced military power on Earth confronts a problem technology alone cannot solve: physics. Cargo must still move physically through space. Fuel must still arrive. Runways must still function. Supply chains must still exist. But here's the problem. Modern military power has become so technologically sophisticated that many observers have forgotten its dependence on vulnerable physical systems underneath. Satellites, missiles, aircraft, cyber capabilities, all of them still rely on infrastructure networks that can be targeted systematically. And once those networks begin collapsing faster than they can be repaired, technological superiority starts losing operational meaning. That is what makes this moment strategically significant. Not because one side achieved total victory, but because a major military structure was forced into confrontation with its own logistical limits in real time. This is where most people miss the larger implication. Every defense ministry in the world is now studying this sequence carefully, not because of politics, because of methodology. The lesson is not regional. The lesson is systemic. Future conflicts may not begin with attempts to destroy armies directly. They may begin with attempts to collapse the sustainment architecture underneath those armies before decisive engagements even occur. That changes military planning entirely, because a force cut off from resupply enters decline automatically, regardless of battlefield bravery or tactical competence. And once that process begins, time itself becomes the enemy. What happens next depends on whether emergency stabilization can occur faster than depletion. That is now the central equation, not ideology, not speeches, not symbolism. Supply versus consumption. Repair speed versus degradation speed, operational endurance versus logistical exhaustion. And those equations are brutally unforgiving, because wars ultimately obey physical laws before political narratives. Fuel runs out, food disappears, ammunition gets consumed, machines break down, human beings become exhausted. No military in history has ever escaped those realities permanently. And what these 5 days demonstrated with startling clarity is that even the most advanced military systems on Earth remain vulnerable to the oldest principle in warfare. An army cut off from sustainment eventually stops functioning, no matter how powerful it once appeared.